January the 27th, 2021, Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke at the session of Davos Agenda 2021 online forum of the World Economic Forum. His speech was held in the telecommunication mode. Political commentators have traditionally attached great importance to the annual Davos Forum. In our opinion, its significance is systematically exaggerated, and contrary to popular opinion, the real significance of the forum in the aspect of resolving urgent and emerging problems of global civilization and the states within its composition is close to zero. This is conditioned by the following. All conversations at the scheduled forum and their final declarations do not oblige any of its participants to anything in their political activities and business, either morally, and this is the main thing, or juridically. None of the forums studied what participants of previous forums said in the past, and how this all affected the present, including trends that entail certain consequences in the future. If something at Davos really affects the subsequent course of events, then it happens in private conversations, on the sidelines of the forum, and not publicly during meetings and protocol events. The preponderance of the speeches are banal in their content and do not give anything that is really necessary for an adequate understanding of the problems of the present and the prospects for their resolution in the future. The last point explains why over the years the media have been reporting on the holding of the scheduled forum, but little is said about the content of the speeches of its participants. This is not because the common people are not supposed to know what the representatives of the governing elites are talking about and what they agree on, but because the elites are the same people of the crowd as the vast majority of the common people, only occupied with the sphere of state and business governance. And therefore, the vast majority of them are unable to express the epochal, destiny-defining wisdom inaccessible to the common man who lives under the rule of all sorts of necessities, many of which are imposed on him by the bad politics produced by the elites. This is typical of all forums, and therefore the Davos Forum appears as an ordinary get-together, in the style of, "It's great that we all gathered here today," which differs from all other get-togethers of this kind only in that the cost of an admission ticket can be expressed either in hard currency or in the political authority of each of them. Davos participants, like most of the common people, do not tend to perceive life directly with their senses, including its spiritual biofield aspects, and do not tend to think independently, especially since it is not characteristic to think in processes. They, like representatives of other crowds in the crowd elite societies, perceive the world mostly indirectly, i.e., from media publications, via the internet, through gossip and rumors circulating in their circles. And the information received in such a way, they evaluate according to their inherent prejudices, among which are opinions of those individuals who are given to them as authorities. They do not ponder over how these prejudices were formed, and for what objectives and tasks they were formed, sometimes even among the generations of their parents and teachers. They do not ponder over the fact that the statistics of real facts of life are qualitatively different from the statistics of the coverage of facts of life in the media, as a result of which the reality is not at all the same as the ideas about it formed by the media in a society of senseless, thoughtless people. This year, however, the participants of the forum were addressed by Vladimir Putin. His speech was very lengthy, interesting, and relevant. However, the media did not pay attention to it, in the sense that they did not show the connection of the statements spoken by Vladimir Putin with real life. The media were busier with the opposition Führer Navalny, the Navalnylings and their so-called unauthorized rallies that took place on January the 23rd, Ukraine, the accession of J.R. Biden as President of the United States. Therefore, Let us pay attention to some provisions that Vladimir Putin brought to the attention, first of all, of the representatives of the governing elite of the West, a regional civilization, with claims at being recognized in the quality of the leader of civilizational development, and that the remainder of humanity submit to it. It is clear that the format of any forum does not allow its participants to give any detailed course of lectures, the thematics of which would be formed for solving certain problems and uniting participants, at least some of them, on the basis of common to them ideas, the meanings of life. Nonetheless, regardless of the format of the forums, the following thematics is always relevant for the socio-political sphere. The spectrum of problems, real problems and illusory problems, generators of problems, that is, the causes that generate problems, and the relationship of problems with each other, determining the place of each of them in the hierarchy of their significance, conditioned by objective laws that govern the life of people, culturally distinctive societies, and humanity as a whole. The attitude of societies and social groups towards real and illusory problems. Policy objectives: maintenance of problems within acceptable boundaries, or resolution of them through the eradication of generators of problems. Scientific methodological support of definition of objectives and politics, the purpose of which is to realize these set objectives, i.e., make the objectives a reality. In the format of any forum, only the first 4 items from this list can be covered. Point 5 can either only be indicated by recommending sources that the interested listeners of the speech should familiarize themselves with, or by leaving it in the defaults. Therefore, the detail of what is behind the words of the speeches on the subject of paragraph 4 must be perceived, comprehended, and rethought on one's own. Since the word moon is but a finger pointing to the moon, woe to the one who takes the finger for the moon, who does not see the moon, or considers the absence of the pointing finger as the absence of the moon. On the basis of this, we will consider some of the provisions expressed by Vladimir Putin at Davos 2021, revealing the defaults accompanying his words in accordance with our world understanding, and showing how what he said relates to life. The question is legitimate. How does our world understanding correlate with life in such a way that our coverage of the correlation of what was said by Putin with life is life consistent? The answer to it is that our explanations flow from what can be called the principle of complementarity of information. It is easiest to explain it with the following example. If you are told that a triangle is right-angled, then if you are familiar with the Pythagorean theorem, you understand that along with the fact that one of the corners of the triangle is 90 degrees, you are also told by default that the sum of the squares on the other 2 sides is equal to the square of the hypotenuse, and that a circle can be described around it, one of the diameters of which will exactly coincide with its hypotenuse. However, these disclosed reservations of the original message are not yours or ours, but a consequence of the objective laws of mathematics. But objective laws operate not only in mathematics. Therefore, through any message, knowing the corresponding objective laws, one can reach the objective information that accompanies this message while remaining in the defaults. The life of people personally, social groups, culturally distinctive societies, and humanity as a whole are also subject to objective laws. Therefore, everything further is conditioned by 2 subjective factors. 1, our knowledge of objective laws, and 2, our culture of world perception and understanding of what is perceived in relation to these laws.
Мы видим кризис прежних моделей и инструментов экономического развития.
The models and instruments of economic development operating now in the dominant regime, practically uncontested on a global scale, are a product of the system-forming principles of the regional civilization called the West or world community. Accordingly, the crisis is not an episode in the cyclical course of various socio-economic processes, but a constant current moment in the collapse of global civilization, i.e., it is global in nature and cannot be resolved on the basis of its own system-forming principles, since it is these system-forming principles which have generated it, reproduce, and exacerbate it. Collapse and crisis are essentially different phenomena. It is possible to regress from a crisis without changing anything in the system involved in the crisis, if the system is in a certain oscillatory periodic mode in which the declines and rises of its characteristic parameters alternate, according to which the quality of its functioning is evaluated. It is impossible to regress from a collapse without changing anything in the system. The way out of a collapse requires the reorganization of the system, and in the most severe cases, the replacement of the old system-forming principles with new ones. That is, a crisis is a temporary phenomenon, a more or less prolonged episode. And collapse is a progressive catastrophe. It will lead to the collapse, perishing of the system, if one does not egress from it, changing the system-forming principles and the system itself in a life-consistent way.
Усиление социального расслоения, как на глобальном уровне, так и в отдельных странах. Ну, об этом мы и раньше говорили, но...
If this was spoken about before, then, with a governorially consistent approach to the analysis and evaluation of the situation, including the possibilities of its further changes, questions that require life-consistent answers are inevitable. If it was spoken about, why was nothing done? If something was done, then what exactly was done, and why did these actions not change the situation for the better, and perhaps even worsened it? What should be implemented and accomplished in order to change the situation for the better? How to do it, including questions of organization of financing. Who will do it, i.e., are there cadres, personnel, or do they need to be trained? However, the posing of these questions and the formation of thoroughly detailed answers to each of them in their interconnection do not fit into the format of forums, including Davos, and most of its participants are not capable of such activities. If one gives a short answer, then either they did nothing or acted on the basis of a system of models and instruments of economic development which could not but generate a collapse, generated one, and continue to aggravate it.
Это, в свою очередь, сегодня вызывает резкую поляризацию общественных взглядов, провоцирует рост популизма, правого и левого радикализма, других крайностей, обострение и ужесточение внутриполитических процессов, в том числе в ведущих странах. Все это неизбежно сказывается и на характере международных отношений, не добавляет им стабильности и предсказуемости. Происходит ослабление международных институтов, множатся региональные конфликты, деградирует и система глобальной безопасности. Вот отмечу здесь, что социальный и ценностный кризис уже оборачивается негативными демографическими последствиями, из-за которых человечество рискует потерять целые цивилизационные и культурные материки.
In relation to all this, socio-economic troubles aggravated by the pandemic about which Vladimir Putin spoke before this, as well as other factors that oppress life external to individuals, are only a catalyst, but not the cause of the emergence of populism and heterogeneous radicalism. The very same cause of this kind of social phenomena is multi-layered. The first layer, the cause of populism, radicalism, and everything else mentioned by Vladimir Putin, the life inconsistency of the world understanding, as those subjects in whose hands the state and business power resides, which is expressed in the creation of problems for the society under their power and the power of foreign partners, sometimes from nothing, as well as those who are forced to live or eke out existence under this power, and from whose ranks, after passing the casting defined in terms of objectives and tasks, the governorial body of the state and business power is replenished. These are by strength of the inadequacy of their world understanding, faced with real and illusory problems. Without understanding their essence, they try to push into life simple solutions to these problems, which leads to aggravation of catastrophes. The second layer, the cause of the first layer, is the inconsistency of the system of general and professional social governorial education given by schools and universities. Curricula are crammed with all sorts of nonsense and deliberate lies, and therefore do not give an adequate idea of biosphere socio-economic systems as objects of governance. The third layer, the cause of the second layer, is the inconsistency of the officialdom of socio-economic sciences developed in the West and imported into Russia in a ready-to-use form throughout the entire time from the start of the reforms by Peter I. Localization of scientific theories, carried out in one form or another, creates the illusion that science is ours, domestic. The fourth layer, the causes of the third layer, are different. The two main ones are the educational system, the main thing in which is cramming and testing for knowledge of the answers it programmed to questions, has generated many book-lovers graphomaniacs who entered science understood as one of the public institutions, being unable to perceive life and being unable to independently comprehend that which is perceived through the senses directly and indirectly through the works of culture. Cowardice, venality, groveling civility of representatives of the scientific officialdom, under the influence of which they not only dare not think freely, produce and announce opinions incompatible with the established traditions, which are purpose-orientedly cultivated by the behind-the-scenes political mafias, but they also expel from science those who oppose the traditions established in the scientific officialdom, regardless of whether the arguments of opponents of traditional opinions are consistent or not.
Наша общая ответственность сегодня заключается в том, чтобы избежать такой перспективы, похожей на мрачную антиутопию. Обеспечить развитие по иной, позитивной, гармоничной и созидательной траектории.
Yes, this is actually so. But are those to whom Vladimir Putin addresses capable of realizing and bearing this responsibility? In our opinion, they are not capable, partly because they do not want to, and, due to the defectiveness of the education they have received, cannot go beyond their inherent prejudices, and partly because they, like representatives of the scientific community, are cowards and are afraid to oppose themselves to the herd pack, called the political and financial economic establishment, since this entails the persecution of the herd pack with the purpose of discouragement of others. This is one of the foundations of power in crowd elite societies. That is, Vladimir Vladimirovich allegorically informed the participants of the Davos Forum that the global civilization was not actually in a systemic crisis, but had moved into collapse, which does not bode well for the future, but promises many troubles that cannot be dealt with on the basis of system-forming principles of the historically shaped global civilization in which the West, the world community, claims to be the leader, to distinguish between truth, lies, and delusions, and as a result, to teach and prescribe living standards for all.
Накапливается огромная масса людей, которые по факту оказываются невостребованными. Так, по оценкам Международной организации труда в 2019 году 21%, или это 267 миллионов молодых людей в мире, нигде не учились и нигде не работали. И даже среди работающих, вот интересный показатель, интересные цифры, и даже среди работающих 30% живут с доходом ниже $3,2 США в сутки по паритету покупательной способности. Такие перекосы в глобальном социально-экономическом развитии стали прямым результатом политики, проводившейся в 80-е годы прошлого века, и зачастую вульгарно проводившейся и догматически. В основе этой политики лежал так называемый Вашингтонский консенсус. С его неписанными правилами, когда приоритет отдается росту экономики на базе частного долга в условиях дерегулирования и низких налогов на богатых и корпорации.
The problems are real, and the main financial economic cause of their occurrence is named the Washington Consensus. In the Washington Consensus, the system-forming principles of organizing financial economic activities in most countries of the world, including Russia, found their expression. And those models and instruments of economic development, the insolvency of which was indicated earlier, are associated with it. However, Vladimir Putin did not present an alternative to the Washington Consensus to the Davos participants. The reasons for this are simple. On the one hand, this cannot be squeezed into the forum formats. For the forum participants, it is necessary to read an alternative to generally accepted socio-economic theories training course, Biosphere Socio-Economic Systems, as an object of governance. This is a serious lesson, which will take more than one day without distraction for buffets. On the other hand, the officialdom of the Russian Academy of Sciences and the Academy of National Economy and Public Administration under the President of the Russian Federation have nothing on this issue to which Vladimir Putin could have referred by showing a book or a pile of books to a camera that would have set out an alternative. Another circumstance, which also remained in the defaults, is that the main system-forming principle of building Western civilization is the presence in culture of two interconnected subsystems-subcultures, Exotericism and Esotericism. Exotericism is information and skills with a stamp for everyone. Esotericism is information and skills with a stamp for the chosen, i.e., for those who have passed a certain casting. With that, esotericism has a multi-directional character in the aspect of objectives, ways and means of achieving them, i.e., in the aspect of ideology, and is hierarchically multi-layered, i.e., what those higher in the hierarchy know and possess the right to do, those who are in the hierarchy below do not possess the right to know and do. In the exotericism-esotericism system, esotericism rules over exotericism, but not over the system as a whole. The system esotericism-exotericism as a whole is dominated by others. If one does not go into details, but briefly, those who are able to 1. Produce knowledge and skills from scratch, and 2. Convince others of what is true and what is false, what is dobro and what is evil. If necessary, raising evil to the rank of dobro. The victim of this is Hitler. And dobro to the rank of evil. Under the influence of such manipulators, the Sanhedrin became an executive mechanism in an attempt to aggress against Christ. Compare the New Testament version of events and the version of events in the Quran, Surah 4, ayats 155 to 162. The presence in the culture of the pair exotericism-esotericism is an expression of Satanism within it, arising from the adherence of esotericists to the principle, we are better than them, exotericists, and therefore we have the right to what they have no right to, and therefore they should be grateful to us and not grumble, no matter what we do. Implementation of this principle in cultural policy is a policy of fooling everyone, including esotericists. But every social group in a society living under the rule of this pair is fooled in every epoch in its own way, preemptively, in accordance with the objectives and tasks of the politics predetermined for the future by the masters of the pair Exotericism, Esotericism.
Определенные надежды на то, что удастся перезагрузить прежнюю модель роста, связаны с бурным технологическим развитием. Действительно, последние 20 лет заложили фундамент для так называемой четвертой промышленной революции, которая основана на повсеместном применении искусственного интеллекта, автоматизированных и роботизированных решений. Пандемия коронавируса значительно ускорила такие разработки и их внедрение.
The unrealizability of such hopes, Vladimir Putin himself expressed in the following words.
Однако этот процесс порождает и новые структурные изменения. Прежде всего, имею в виду рынок труда. На рынке труда, значит, без эффективных действий государства множество людей рискуют остаться без работы. Причем зачастую это так называемый средний класс. А это, что это такое? Это основа любого современного общества. И в этой связи о втором фундаментальном вызове предстоящего десятилетия. Общественно-политическом. Рост экономических проблем и неравенство раскалывают общество, порождают социальную, расовую, национальную нетерпимость. Причем такое напряжение прорывается наружу даже в странах с, казалось бы, устоявшимися гражданскими и демократическими институтами, призванными сглаживать, гасить подобные явления и эксцессы. Системные социально-экономические проблемы порождают такое общественное недовольство, что это требует особого внимания, требует того, чтобы эти проблемы решались по существу. Опасная иллюзия, что их можно, что называется, проигнорировать, пропустить, загнать куда-то в угол, она чревата серьезными последствиями. В таком случае общество все равно будет разделено и политически, и социально. Потому что для людей причина быть недовольными заключается на самом деле не в каких-то умозрительных вещах, а в реальных проблемах, которые касаются каждого. Каких бы взглядов, в том числе политических, человек реально не придерживался. Или как он думает, что он придерживается. А вот реальные проблемы порождают недовольство. И, наконец, третий вызов, а точнее явная угроза, с которой мы можем столкнуться в наступившем десятилетии. Это дальнейшее обострение всего комплекса международных проблем. Ведь нерешенные и нарастающие внутренние социально-экономические проблемы могут подталкивать к поиску того, на кого можно все свалить, обвинить во всех бедах и перенаправить раздражение и недовольство своих граждан. И мы это уже видим. Мы ощущаем, что градус внешнеполитической, пропагандистской риторики нарастает. Можно ожидать, что более агрессивным станет и характер практических действий, включая давление на те страны, которые не согласны с ролью послушных управляемых сателлитов. Использование торговых барьеров, нелегитимные санкции, ограничения в финансовой, технологической, информационной сферах. Вот абсолютно ясно, что мир не может идти по пути построения экономики, работающей на миллион человек или даже на золотой миллиард. Это просто деструктивная позиция. Такая модель по определению неустойчива. А недавние события, в том числе миграционные кризисы, вновь это подтвердили. Сейчас важно от общей констатации перейти к делу. Направить реальные усилия и ресурсы на то, чтобы добиться как снижения социального неравенства внутри отдельных стран, так и постепенного сближения уровня экономического развития разных стран и регионов планеты. Тогда и миграционных кризисов не будет.
If we recall the work of the Club of Rome, The Limits to Growth, 1972, the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, 1992, from the general stating of facts, it should have long proceeded to action. And if we recall the Tehran Conference 1943, then, in accordance with the agreements reached there by J.V. Stalin and F.D. Roosevelt, after only 2 years, rates that are now unattainable in international projects, the UN was created. As can be understood from the UN Charter, the UN was created not in order that the global civilization endlessly balance on the brink of a world nuclear and even more terrible war, and generate a global biosphere social, ecological crisis. In fact, the collapse of the global biosphere socio-economic system, but in order that, relying on the scientific and economic power and authority of the USSR and the USA, in their interaction to help all peoples to solve their problems and the problems of mankind, about which, 75 years later, Vladimir Putin was forced to speak again, addressing the participants of Davos 2021. However, humanity, first of all the governing elites, but with the connivance of the common people, ungiftedly and in vain spent 3/4 of a century on wars and stagnation which could have been used to transform the entire earth. And for this one must be grateful to Winston Churchill and his puppeteers, who, with the Sinews of Peace, the Iron Curtain speech, March the 5th, 1946, marked the beginning of the Cold War. And one should not delude oneself that the Davosians understood Vladimir Putin, were imbued with new ideas, and will now begin to work on bringing global civilization out of collapse and solving the problems of all peoples of the earth. The psychology and world understanding characteristic of the vast majority of representatives of the business elite and political elite of all countries, subordinate to the global business community and its puppeteers, do not allow the shift from words about poverty of life towards action for its transformation, and have not allowed for several thousand years, if we count the time from the revelations of Christ and Moses. Further, Vladimir Putin speaks about the desirable global politics, the implementation of which is necessary in order to bring global civilization out of collapse and ensure normal life in all states of the world in the continuity of generations.
Смыслы, акценты такой политики, призванные обеспечить устойчивое и гармоничное развитие, очевидны. Что это? Это создание новых возможностей для каждого. Условия для развития и реализации потенциала человека вне зависимости от того, где он родился и живет. И здесь обозначу 4 ключевые приоритета. Ну, так как они мне видятся как приоритеты. Ничего, может быть, оригинального не скажу, но тем не менее, поскольку Клаус позволил высказать позицию России, мою позицию, я, безусловно, это сделаю. Первое. У человека должна быть комфортная среда для жизни. Это жилье и доступная инфраструктура. Транспортная, энергетическая, коммунальная. И, конечно, экологическое благополучие. Об этом мы никогда не должны забывать. Второе. Человек должен быть уверен, что у него будет работа, которая даст устойчивый, растущий доход и, соответственно, достойный уровень жизни. Он должен иметь доступ к действенным механизмам обучения в течение всей своей жизни. Сегодня это абсолютно необходимо, позволяющие ему развиваться и строить свою карьеру. А после ее завершения получить достойную пенсию и социальный пакет. Третье. Человек должен быть уверен, что он получит качественную, эффективную медицинскую помощь, когда это требуется. Что система здравоохранения в любом случае гарантирует ему доступ к современному уровню услуг. Четвертое. Независимо от дохода семьи, дети должны иметь возможность получить достойное образование и реализовать свой потенциал. А такой потенциал есть у каждого ребенка. И только так можно будет гарантировать наиболее эффективное развитие современной экономики. Экономики, где люди не средства, а цель. И только те страны, которые смогут добиться прогресса по обозначенным 4 направлениям, они, конечно, наверное, не исчерпывающие, я сказал только о главном. Но только те страны, которые смогут добиться прогресса, хотя бы по этим 4 направлениям, обеспечат себе устойчивое и инклюзивное развитие.
One should agree with this. But at the same time, it is necessary to understand that under these politics, global, external, and internal, in the official science of all countries, there is no scientific methodological support for state governance towards biosphere socio-economic systems, including governance in production and consumer systems at the macro level, economic activity within the state, and the mega level, economic activity in interaction of production-consumer systems of several states, as well as in their interaction on a global scale, without which the resolution of biosphere socio-economic ecological crisis is impossible, and its further development is capable of destroying the biosphere together with the ecological niche of the biological species Homo sapiens, i.e., the preservation of the biosphere and biocenoses everywhere should be the main objective of the politics of any state, but it has dropped out of the real politics of all states. There is not even a small number of active governorial cadres who have mastered this kind of scientific methodological support of biosphere socio-economic governance. But even in societies, there are not enough potential governors who could support such politics. The reason for this state of affairs is that the concerned public of different ideological persuasions, including the preponderance of those who are convinced of their true commitment to the conception of social safety, instead of learning to perceive real life with their senses, learning to independently comprehend what is perceived, mastering knowledge adequate to life, and transforming it into practical skills, prefer to engage in psychological masturbation, to watch and empathize with videos in which their idols expound to them their understanding of the meaning of the concerned public's life. And in this aspect of their being, they are no different from regulars of Pornhub. What each of their idols is worth is a separate issue, the consideration of which is not part of the task of this analysis. Admirers of any idol, however, violate the commandment, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image," a fact which does not allow them to mature to the level of human, the successor of God on earth. And if the head of state becomes such an idol, then this is a betrayal in relation to the head of state and a betrayal of the motherland, because a lot of crowd representatives begin to hope that the sovereign alone, without their active, proactive, and competent help, which requires assimilation of knowledge and transformation of knowledge into skills, will carry the motherland out of catastrophe into a wonderful epoch, while they themselves will indulge in consumerism and all kinds of perversion. And sowing such illusions in the crowd is not only a betrayal of the motherland, but also a betrayal of the truth of God, a betrayal of God because no one in his person, no matter how previous, powerful and capable, is able to replace not only the whole of humanity or a culturally unique society, but even its governorial body, all workers in the sphere of heterogeneous power. No university in the world prepares students for programs the development of which would provide the creation and improvement of such scientific methodological support for governance towards biosphere socio-economic systems. Mastery of this scientific methodological support for governance towards biosphere socio-economic systems. Therefore, Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, Cambridge, Moscow State University, Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration, the Higher School of Economics, and other universities and faculties that train students in the specialities of a social governorial character, according to the rating of usefulness to society, should come after vocational schools that teach useful professions, and in the aspect of training cadres for the sphere of biosphere socio-economic governance, all such universities and faculties should have a negative rating, since they harm the development of people personally, the development of culturally distinctive societies, and the development of global civilization as a whole. Not one state supports social initiatives aimed at the development and mastery of this kind of scientific methodological support, and many states, including Russia, are inclined to suppress and repress such initiatives because one of the functions of state power within them is to defend the Washington Consensus and other system-forming principles of globalization carried out by the higher-ups of the West, the world community, in order to establish a global, alternativeless tyranny. All priorities named by Vladimir Putin are related to the economic sphere. However, even the very possibility of solving purely economic problems are conditioned by the quality of the culture of society. If the quality of the culture of society does not allow the solution of these problems, then they cannot be solved. But the development of culture in the direction of achieving the necessary quality that allows to ensure intrasocial harmony and harmony in the interaction of civilization and the noosphere also requires a correspondent component in the scientific methodological support of state and economic governance. Therefore, without the setting and the solution of the problems of cultural development of societies and the personal development of people, problems of an economic nature cannot be solved. But this also applies to many other tasks, including engineering, medical, pedagogical.
Именно эти подходы лежат в основе стратегии, которую реализует и моя страна, Россия. Наши приоритеты построены вокруг человека, его семьи, направлены на демографическое развитие и сбережение народа, на повышение благополучия людей, защиту их здоровья. Мы работаем над тем, чтобы создать условия для достойного и эффективного труда и успешного предпринимательства, обеспечить цифровую трансформацию как основу технологического уклада будущего всей страны, а не узкой группы компаний.
Everything that is said in the previous comments fully applies to Russia. So, the architecture of the post-Soviet statehood of Russia, that is, the set and functions of government bodies, their interconnections, legislation and law enforcement practice are shaped for the impossibility of exercising sovereignty in its entirety, for the crypto-colonial nature of economy, for the protection of the Washington Consensus and other system-forming principles of the West, the world community. Therefore, everything that was said by Vladimir Putin in this fragment of his speech in Russia is done haphazardly, by trial and error, without scientific methodological support that meets the tasks of development. Russia differs from the states of the rest of the world only in that the genetic core of our multinational civilization, which has developed within the boundaries of a common for its people's state, strives to embody on earth the highest, beyond worldly previousness of God forever. Outside the officialdom of science, there is a basis for scientific methodological support of social governance, including state governance and governance within the production-consumer system of the state.
Реальность такова, что в мире сформировались, заявили о себе действительно разные центры развития со своими самобытными моделями, моделями политическими, системами политическими, общественными институтами. И сегодня крайне важно выстроить механизмы согласования их интересов, чтобы многообразие, естественная, абсолютно естественная конкуренция полюсов развития не обернулись анархией, чередой затяжных конфликтов.
In this case, the use of the word development is inappropriate. The fact is that in the historically formed cultures of all peoples, there are interests, the realization of which entails the degradation and acceleration of the collapse of these cultures and the peoples of their carriers. Along with these interests, however, stemming from what has been called the animal principle in man since ancient times, there are interests arising from what has been called the divine principle in man since ancient times. Some of the interests arising from the animal principle are, at their core, incompatible with the interests of development arising from the divine principle, and therefore, in the course of the development of culture and personal development of people, degradational interests must be eradicated. Some part of the interests inherent in man as a representative of the biosphere of Earth, and therefore also attributed to the animal principle, should be fully satisfied with no alternative. But, at the same time, their satisfaction should be subordinated to the priority of satisfaction of interests of development arising from the divine principle. Therefore, in principle, it is impossible to build mechanisms for the reconciliation of degradational interests and demographically conditioned interests of development. But the distinction between degradational interests and the processes that express them in the life of society, and the interests of development and the processes expressing them, is not a question in the answer to which the truth is determined by the opinion of the qualified majority based on the results of voting. The difference between degradation and development is of an objective nature, independent of the opinions of people and victories in the disputes about the nravs of certain social groups. Howbeit, the recognition of degradational interests and interests directed towards development also requires scientific methodological support and a personal sense of measure. The sense of God's predetermination of the existence of this world and of man and humanity within it.
Для этого в том числе нам предстоит заняться укреплением и развитием универсальных институтов, на которых лежит особая ответственность за обеспечение стабильности и безопасности в мире, за выработку правил поведения и в глобальной экономике, в торговле.
This is not realizable without the solution to the problems mentioned in the commentary of the previously shown fragment of Putin's speech. In addition, this requires Russia to restore in fullness its own sovereignty, starting with sensory intellectual sovereignty. We cannot live and develop on the basis of the Western way of world perception and understanding of that which is perceived.
Дорогие друзья, все мы знаем, что конкуренция, соперничество между странами в мировой истории не прекращались и не прекращаются, не прекратятся никогда. И противоречия, столкновения интересов, на самом деле это тоже естественная вещь для столь сложного организма, как сегодняшняя вообще человеческая цивилизация. Однако в переломные моменты это не мешало, а напротив побуждало объединять усилия на самых важных, действительно судьбоносных направлениях. И мне представляется, что сейчас именно такой период.
What is called competition and rivalry between countries is in fact a struggle for undivided world domination. It is indeed inevitable and therefore unavoidable until the end of globalization, which will result in the emergence of a culture common to all people on Earth. But in the struggle for undivided world domination can be expressed both the animal principle, which will lead to the end of the collapse of the global civilization by its perishing, and possibly the extinction of the biological species Homo sapiens, and the divine principle, which will lead to intrasocial harmony and harmony in the interrelationship between civilization and the biosphere of the Earth in the continuity of generations, and this will be the beginning of a new stage in the history of mankind. But the second variant requires not senseless and weak-willed reproduction in the succession of generations of the system-forming, essentially satanic, principles of civilization of the West world community. But it requires the personal development of people, their creativity, subordinate to Sovest, the divine principle, the development of culture and people themselves as a biological species. The second variant requires setting of objectives in accordance with the objective laws that govern the lives of people, and cooperation from the generosity of the soul in the common interests of development.
Очень важно честно оценивать ситуацию, сосредоточиться не на мнимых, а на реальных глобальных проблемах. на устранение дисбалансов, критически важных для всего международного сообщества. И тогда, уверен, мы сможем добиться успеха. Достойно ответить на вызовы третьего десятилетия 21 века.
Everything is correct, but it should be supplemented by that which for various subjective and objective reasons remained in the defaults of the speech of Vladimir Putin and what we have thus far disclosed in this analysis. In particular, at this level of politics, not every politician can afford to be honest, both for reasons of personal safety and in order to avoid the disclosure of various kinds of information, the disclosure of which could destroy the projected future.
Вы знаете, у нас есть вещи абсолютно фундаментального характера. Это общая культура. Крупнейшие политические деятели Европы недавнего прошлого говорили о необходимости развития отношений между Европой и Россией, указывая на то, что Россия есть часть Европы. И географически, что самое главное, в культурном смысле этого слова. По сути, это одна цивилизация. Французские лидеры говорили о необходимости создания единого пространства от Лиссабона до Урала. Но я считаю, и тоже об этом сказал, почему до Урала, до Владивостока. Мне лично, я лично слышал позицию бывшего выдающегося европейского политического деятеля, канцлера Гельмута Коля, который говорил о том, что если европейская культура хочет сохраниться и остаться одним из центров мировой цивилизации в будущем, имея в виду все проблемы и тенденции развития мировой цивилизации, то, конечно, Западная Европа и Россия должны быть вместе. Но трудно с этим не согласиться. Мы придерживаемся точно такой же точки зрения и позиции.
However, a large part of the intellectuals of the West looks and will continue to look at such statements coming from Russia through the prism of the displayed caricature, which appeared several years ago. And they will look at it precisely in this way, and for already mentioned reasons, they themselves cannot arrive at the idea that it's necessary to perceive and comprehend that which is happening in Russia and that which is done by it in a different way. Therefore, this theme needs clarification. Furthermore, the author of this caricature did not dare or did not think to depict the USA and the entire American continent on this map of the world, but it should have been depicted, since the frightening to the West, the world community, Russian project of multinational globalization resides in the defaults of this caricature. Yes, Europe and the West as a whole, on the one hand, and Russia on the other hand, have much commonality. This exists by strength of the fact that 1. We all belong to the same biological species. 2. The process of cultural interaction of both regional civilizations has been ongoing for several centuries. Russia, due to the specifics of its civilizational mission, has adopted from the West many times more than the West has adopted from Russia. The civilizational mission of Russia, a Russian multinational regional civilization developing within the boundaries of a state common to all its people, in the process of globalization, is to be a kind of tester of the life consistency of the achievements of other civilizations. If Russia accepts and integrates into its culture something created by others, this something will somehow enter the future global culture in which all of humanity will be united in one way or another. If Russia rejects something created by others, then it will not enter the future global culture, and the developers of this something will face problems if they insist on the obligation of this something both for themselves and for others. In addition to the mission of tester, Russia carries out the mission of programmer-generator of living standards for humanity as a whole for the future. It is precisely this that the meaning of the defaults of the poem by F.I. Chuchev consists. Russia cannot be understood with the mind alone. No ordinary yardstick can span her greatness. She stands alone, unique. In Russia, one can only believe. With a mind, formed by an education of the European type, ordinary yardstick is a metaphor for living standards, i.e., norms of the life of society, its social organization. Russia truly creates and sets living standards for the future. For example, the tasks that were solved in Russia during the time of Ivan the Terrible, statehood common to many nations, a single macroeconomic system, a single financial system, common standards in the usual technological understanding, the European Union is trying to solve these days, since the signing of the Maastricht Treaty on February 7, 1992. And there is no avoiding this, since the mission of Russia is prescribed in the algorithmics of the noosphere of the Earth, and the adequacy of this position is confirmed by history, if we see it not in a collection of random facts, but an expression of the entirely purpose-oriented algorithmicness of the flow of life, which can be cognized in accordance with which politics should be built. As noted by Burchard Christoph von Munich, a field marshal general, a German in the Russian service, the Russian state has the advantage over all the others in that it is governed directly by the Lord God himself. Otherwise, it is impossible to explain how it exists at all. And this circumstance should be taken into account by both foreign political subjects and domestic ones. Those who have understood this circumstance not dobrosoviestiously, but following historically established traditions that have lost their relevance and promise, Nicholas II is one of them, or understood it based on Sovietlessly inflated self-evaluations, Napoleon, Hitler, Yeltsin, Sobchak in particular, or did not understand at all, they ran into great troubles. Intellectuals of the West sense the mission of Russia's regional civilization in some way, but being hostage to prejudices formed by the education system and other system-forming principles of building the regional civilization West, the world community, they interpret this mission precisely in the style of the presented caricature. Russia and Vladimir Putin personally are a threat to their civilizational mission, which they evaluate as unconditionally correct, leaderly, and enlightening in relation to other nations, if these nations are able to perceive this enlightenment, and forcedly punitive up to genocide if they reject this enlightenment. Great Britain in its colonies, and in the countries with which it fought, killed more people than the Nazis. Throughout its history, the United States has also managed to create genocide with impunity in many places. Based on this vision and understanding of globalization and their mission within it, their attitude towards Vladimir Putin and Russia, the West, after the Munich speech of Vladimir Putin, expressed in one phrase, Putin, the louse that roared. The irony of the attitude of Western intellectuals towards Vladimir Putin personally and towards Russia as a whole, expressed in the presented caricature and other facts, stems from both their awareness of the civilizational leadership of the West and conditioned by the intoxication of this illusion of the mania of superiority over other peoples, including over the peoples of Russia, which has been experiencing a systemic crisis for the past half-century, and from a sincere non-understanding of the civilizational mission of Russia. To sober up the intellectuals of the West, the world community, from arrogance and disdain for dissenting people and peoples of other regional civilizations, and to return them from the world of Western illusions to reality, can only be achieved with a clearly prescribed conception of globalization, an alternative to the one implemented by the West according to its system-forming principles. In Russia, this exists, but it is outside the officialdom of science and politics. Until such time as our conception of globalization, oriented on the life of each and every one under the power of the dictatorship of Soviet, is presented to the West at the level of the officialdom of science and politics, as well as bypassing the scientific and political officialdom of the Western states, the problems in relations between Russia and the West are unsolvable. This is precisely what is expressed in the presented caricature, but in a sneering form of arrogant ridicule. Those who perform the truth and previousness are supported by God, who gives them assistance in the eradication of untruth and evil, and the elimination of obstacles in their path. We also note that Vladimir Putin, in his speech, repeatedly mentioned the COVID-2019 pandemic, but did not mention that it was the result of a biological weapons leak, sanctioned by the world behind the scenes, in order to mitigate the global biosphere-social environmental crisis through a controlled reduction of the world's population of up to 1 to 2 billion over the next 10 to 15 years, which will entail a reduction in the volume of production and the volume of pollution thrown by civilization into the natural environment. This is one of the directions of global politics which cannot be resisted without the restoration of the sovereignty of society and the state in its entirety, starting with sensory intellectual sovereignty.
Большое спасибо, господин президент.
Спасибо вам. Thank you so much.